Good morning, everyone. My name is Garrett Sheehan. I'm President and CEO of the Greater New Haven Chamber of Commerce. We'll be getting started in just a moment. We'll let everyone get into the webinar. Good morning, everyone. My name is Garrett Sheehan. I'm President and CEO of the Greater New Haven Chamber of Commerce and Quinnipiac Chamber of Commerce. We appreciate you joining us this morning on Juneteenth. Today's webinar is Economic and Diversity Inclusion from Lip Service to Action. We'll get started in just a moment, but before we do, I want to thank all of our sponsors that allow us to put on this programming through the pandemic: Connecticut Natural Gas, Southern Connecticut Gas, and UI. And then also our streaming partners. We work with many other chambers across the region that help continue to spread the programming that we put on for you through these webinars. Also, all of our investors, this is the way we've been able to operate through the pandemic, is through the support of these businesses and other organizations. It's only with their support that we've been able to continue to provide the services that we've provided through this time period and also put on this programming. I now want to welcome in Jeff Klaus with Webster Bank. Jeff is the chair of the board of directors for the Greater New Haven Chamber of Commerce, and Jeff joins us this morning to give a brief welcome. Jeff?
Good morning, and thank you, Garrett. I am really happy that the Chamber is commemorating Juneteenth by hosting this highly topical and very relevant conversation about how we can propel the mission of economic diversity and inclusion. I am proud that over the last few years, the Chamber has promoted the goals of diversity and inclusion, and we've actually adopted these into the heart of our brand new strategic plan. In fact, the values of inclusive growth are contained in the first sentence of our new mission statement. But it's not enough just to say what we're for. It's not enough to build support systems within the Chamber organization to further these goals. So now, in the midst of a very tumultuous national conversation, the time has come to put our values into action. It is time to walk the talk. So I am now very much looking forward to pushing my mute button and listening carefully to our esteemed panelists today on how we can turn a growing public outcry into concrete action steps, and how we can finally begin to experience and recognize what a diverse and inclusive economy truly looks like. Thank you very much for joining us and tuning in. Garrett?
Thanks, Jeff. We appreciate it. I now want to introduce the chairs of our Diversity and Inclusion Council: Cecil Austin with CH Insurance and Jean Christensen with Jean Christensen Associates. Our Diversity and Inclusion Council played a huge role in putting together today's session, and he's not on the screen, but I want to recognize Jesse Phillips on our staff who helped put together this panel as well. So Cecil and Jean, maybe you could tell us just a little bit about the Diversity and Inclusion Council and provide a welcome to everyone.
Yeah, and thanks, Garrett. And first, I'd like to thank everyone who's participating in today's event. The council is one of the missions of the council is to support and encourage the growth of minority-owned businesses within the Greater New Haven community. Putting together events like this, having discussions, trying to identify ways, one, to help grow minority-owned businesses within the chamber itself, but also to support them in the growth in their daily activities, continue growth throughout the years to come. I wanted to also take a little time today to encourage everyone listening to take time out to try to become a member of the Diversity and Inclusion Council of the Greater New Haven Chamber. It's a very easy step to do that. All you need to do is contact the chamber, identify that you want to become a member, and then we'll add you to our distribution list for future events and meetings. I hope to hear from all of you moving forward so we can continue to move discussions like this forward. Jean?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jean Christensen. I'm the president of Jean Christensen Associates, and I'm the co-chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Council. And I just wanted to share that I am very excited and proud to be part of the council, because I think that there is, above and beyond what's happening in this moment in time in history, there's a real need for a conversation about inclusion, and there's a real need for a conversation around diversity. So I'm pleased to be part of a team and an organization who sees this as a priority. Thank you.
Thank you both. We really appreciate it. And if you are interested in joining the council, you can reach out to me, Jesse, Cecil, or Jean, anyone on the chamber team, and we will get you involved. I now want to welcome in our panel. We have an excellent panel with us this morning. And thank you again to the Diversity and Inclusion Council. I'll introduce each of them. Let me give you a little rundown of the format for today. Very similar to how we've handled our other webinars. If you have questions, comments, please put them in the chat. We will get to as many of them as we possibly can towards the end. But we are joined this morning by Carlton Heilsmith, a business leader, philanthropist, humanitarian, and chairman and founder of CONCAT. Karen Dubois Walton, executive director of Elm City Communities. Dr. Don Sawyer III, Vice President for Equality and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer for Quinnipiac University, and Sean Wooden, State Treasurer for the state of Connecticut. So I'll ask all of our panelists to turn on their cameras now and join us in this session. And what we'll do is we'll go to each of them, have them say a few words, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So again, you can start putting those questions into the chat box. Treasurer Wooden, thank you so much for joining us. I'll have you open us up this morning, and I know you have been very out in front about the way corporate America can respond to this moment. But again, thank you for joining us here with the Chamber.
Thank you, Garrett, and I really do appreciate being invited to join you for this really important conversation. And I should start with saying in my bio, just as important as anything else is being state treasurer. I'm a father of two boys, 17 and 14, and that also informs deeply in a personal way, in addition to kind of my professional and governmental role, how I come to this diversity and inclusion conversation, because the tragedies in our nation have been extremely painful to watch and to experience, and to have, almost for a period of time, daily dinner conversations with my sons about, the question, is it safe to jog? I have a runner, as I've written about. But so what I believe is that all of us who are committed to moving our country forward as it relates to diversity and inclusion and eliminating systemic racism and bias in society, we need to, wherever we sit or stand, we need to influence and move the needle and do that. As state treasurer, I have a lot of dealings, I call it a front row seat to Wall Street and corporate America. And I believe that they, in the business community, you can play a large role in shaping this discussion and the future trajectory of our country. And so I've called on corporate America and Wall Street to get off the sidelines and to truly become engaged in moving us forward. And when I talk about engagement, it starts with, of course, in this moment, the efforts at police reform. I believe that has become, or I know that has become very clear to a majority of Americans that that's something that we need to do. But beyond that, and that's why this conversation is so important, we need to look at disparities throughout our society based on race. When you look at economics, which we're talking about today, when you look at healthcare, when you look at education, when you look at housing, my call to action is, let's, even after the protests, let's do the hard work that takes a long period of time to systemically address these issues. And so, and in particular, I'm excited because of the space I operate in to engage in a conversation around economic inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. We appreciate you having you on here, and we'll come back in just a moment. Let me turn now to Dr. Don Sawyer. And Donald, talk about the issues that are most important to you right now, but also share with us a little bit more about Juneteenth. It is just in the last week picked up more momentum of acknowledgement around the rest of this country. It has obviously been going on for a very long time. I have to admit myself that I was not as aware of the date. It's recognized as the end of slavery. Obviously, there were still many things that occurred after that date. But can you give us a little context on Juneteenth for everyone who's listening here today?
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me, and happy Juneteenth to those who are celebrating. And so I have a couple of things I wanted to say about Juneteenth. And so we understand that Juneteenth has been celebrated before just this year, even though a number of people are having an awakening to it. And so it's the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the United States. We know that the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, put into effect on January 1st, 1863. And the news didn't get to the enslaved Africans in Texas until 1865, June 19th. And so the June and the 19th was combined to make Juneteenth. And so sometimes, it's referred to as the Juneteenth Independence Day. It's also called Freedom Day or Emancipation Day. And this is a celebration of people of African descent here in the US celebrating this moment of freedom. And so you have family gatherings where people pause and reflect on the history, the current moment, and how we plan to move forward in the future. And so this has just been a time of reflection and looking towards making changes for the future. And so the way that it's happening this year with the current uprisings, it's been interesting. And I have to admit, if I'm being honest, that at times I feel a little bit uneasy about this new level of recognition of Juneteenth and some of these other holidays and points that we're talking about these days. Because in a way, like when we think about Facebook adding new backdrops and Netflix adding new sections of movies and them removing the Aunt Jemima image and everyone is talking about Juneteenth, the part where it causes pain is that people have celebrated this for years. The other piece, when we talk about this new recent and awakening to racism, people of color, Black people, Indigenous people have talked about this oppression for so long, right? That we've talked about this oppression. This article that I read on Metro UK talked about how we put it in our music, we protested peacefully, we put it on in our in our songs, in our movies, and on stage, and no one listened. And now it seems like people are listening. And so, although these movements are great, and they're moving us to a place where we want to be, I would be lying if I say I didn't feel some uneasiness inside because of a lack of trust in the system that has heard all of these things before and has never seen a way to kind of move forward and address these things. And so I'm forever an optimist. And so I'm hoping that this new notion or these new ideas that we're starting to become familiar with, that it moves us into a place that we move from just this moment into a movement. Because I think, words matter. Seeing people say Black Lives Matter, different corporations and things of that nature, words matter, but I think actions are more important. And so I think it's on us to hold us accountable to move forward with developing, anti-racist policies and practices and really walk out this mission of inclusive excellence.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. And it's tragic that it took George Floyd's senseless death for us to be able to be at this moment. And let's not squander it as a nation. But it's sad that it took that. And so, Karen, I'd like to bring you in, and I know you have some slides as well. But thank you for joining us. And I know actually you had a big announcement yesterday as well with Elm City Communities.
Yes, thank you, Garrett. Great to be here. First, I really want to thank and acknowledge the Chamber for creating this space and really making an intentional shift around how the Chamber is engaging around these issues. There is such significance in you doing this on Juneteenth. I was really impressed in reading the statements, Garrett, that you put out from the chamber, where you explicitly said that the chamber would not be silent about these issues anymore. Where you really reiterated your commitment to inclusive growth, but also to recognizing that intersections with housing, which certainly warmed my heart as a large housing provider and developer in this community, but also calling out around education and policing and incarceration and health disparities and just the centuries of racism. So appreciate that. And we're in a moment where we're seeing this is not a new moment, as Dr. Sawyer just raised. It's not a new moment for Black communities, for communities of color, for Indigenous communities. But there is something new about the way in which there's been an awakening in a much larger community. In corporate sections, we see in large corporate boards taking steps like Reddit replacing its founder board seat with a Black tech entrepreneur. We see corporations coming out with statements, and we see a recognition that this is not just a moment, and we need to continue to move it into something more powerful than that. And so I thought, rather than going through a ton of slides, so we can be more conversational, I just would orient a little bit to how we are creating Elm City Communities as a space that lives its commitment to equity. And we are at the very core an anti-poverty organization that uses housing as the way to do that. Most people think of us around the sort of quasi-governmental role, but we are a developer. We are a major driver of economic opportunity in this community for the residents that we're working with, but for all of the businesses that can benefit from the spend that we make in this community. And so we need to remain aligned in our practice to what it is that we say we are. So we are annual operating budget of over $100 million. And on the development side, we have developed over, at this point, more than $500 million in investment in this community. And we have done that in ways that want to ensure that that people are at the table around the decision making and are benefiting from that spend in the community. We create a equitable organization by ensuring that our leadership and our team is reflective of our community. Our workforce is predominantly people of color. It is predominantly a female driven workforce. Folks at every level of the organization are making decisions, are people that reflect the community. And we operate from, the double bottom line. We have to remain profitable, and we are very focused on what our social mission is, again, as an anti-poverty mission. And so I think, as I think about what our approach is, our equity focus, it's been around building the team, communicating very clearly, and making intentional actions. So thank you for raising the rent relief item that we did. That was one of those moments of trying to remain aligned around who we say we are and the actions we make. And canceling rent is something that runs counter to the very core of any landlord, right? Our business is about collecting rent. But when we thought about what our real purpose was and our focus and how we could align our resources in a way that really centered the people we're supposed to be serving, we were able to get very creative about ways in which we could do that. And we're able to roll that out and announce that yesterday. So thank you for highlighting that. I thought I would just delve in a moment on our spend, particularly around these major development deals that we do that put so much money out. We've made intentional commitments about how much of that money will go to minority-owned businesses, will go to women-owned businesses, and a category that we refer to as Section 3 businesses, which are businesses that are owned by or majority employ people who are low income in our community. And so we've set our goals and we have consistently exceeded those goals in the work that we do. And we do that by making sure that people are clear about what we're doing, make clear that this is something that we're serious about. When we're working with a prime contractor, we make it very clear what they need to be doing, and we make very clear outreach to businesses to give them opportunities to do work. And so when you look at our total development of what we've done, again, it's over $500 million at this point. I dug into the last 7 deals that we've done, which totaled 90 million of that. And in that, 40% of those dollars went to businesses that qualified under a set aside. Of that 90 million, 29 million, which represents 31%, went to minority-owned businesses, 13 million or 14% to women-owned businesses, and 40% or 37 million went to the combined group. And so we're very proud of that. We think it's a model for how this approach comes into action into real economic benefit in our community. And so I'm happy to engage in some conversation with others about what this moment means and how we can continue to translate into action. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Appreciate it. And Carlton Highsmith. Carlton, thank you for joining us. We always appreciate being able to talk with you. And I don't think I'm stepping out of line to say you are one of the most revered business leaders in our community. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of things over the many decades that have tried to move us forward, but we obviously have so much more room to go, and there's been so many unfulfilled promises. So give us some of your thoughts on this moment now and how we move into action and take steps forward.
Thank you, Garrett, and thanks to the Chamber for inviting me here today. I am so thrilled to be on the panel with Don, who I worked with at Quinnipiac University. We were on a call almost all day yesterday together, the board call. And Sean, thank you for giving me the opening about boys. I have 2 grandsons, 4 and 8. And so I'm very much tuned in to what's going on today. And Karen, this is the second time in the last 10 days you've been on a panel, on a webinar with a member of my family. So delighted to see you again.
Feeling very lucky.
My mom is a big fan of Karen. I told her that. This for me is a very interesting time because I'm asked on many occasions to give speeches, and what the host typically tells me is that we want you to talk about how we create more entrepreneurs like you. How do we create more Black businesses of the size and scale that you ran? And when I would go, I would give speeches. I talk about operational excellence. I talk about value proposition. I talk about innovation. But it occurred to me recently that I've been talking about the wrong things. What's really needed is a conversation about opportunity. Because if I look at the single key to the success I've had over the years, it was because of opportunity. Opportunity that individuals at Johnson & Johnson, that magnificent company in New Jersey that operates under this credo, or the vision for those who are not familiar with it, that talks about how they will treat people in terms of with respect and dignity, how they will be inclusive in their thinking, how they will be open, how they will be expansive and looking at opportunities to grow their supplier base, how they will embrace diversity and inclusion. Were it not for wonderful people at places like Johnson & Johnson that embraced this young startup entrepreneur working out of a basement office in Haven to listen to my story, give me an opportunity that ultimately became a solution for a major problem they had with one of their categories and catapulted my company. Wonderful people at companies like Procter & Gamble that has a CEO, H.E. Lafley, who was actually brilliant in the way he spun the argument. His argument was, my job at Procter & Gamble is to sell more toothpaste, more soap, and more shampoo. And what will enable me to do that? I need a growing population. I need to have that growing population have disposable income. Now he looked around and said, what are the growing populations? The growing populations are minority populations, people of color. They're the fastest growing segment of the population. Now what is missing? I need for that population to have disposable income so they can afford to buy my toothpaste, my soap, and my shampoo. And so he said, we have to be intentional about having an inclusive environment where we hire people who don't look like us, who are represented in this people of colors category, because we need for them to have income. We also need for them to create wealth. And how do we do that? We do that by finding suppliers who are diverse suppliers, because diverse suppliers on average employ more diverse employees. And so if we bring in more diverse suppliers, we can create wealth. That wealth is transitioned to the diverse employees. And so therefore, I am creating people who could buy more of my soap, more of my shampoo, more of my toothpaste. And when you have a compelling business case like that he made to the 300,000 employees around the world, you have an organization that embraces diversity, embraces how do we bring on more diverse suppliers. I think the saddest thing for me is to know that there are symphonies and melodies that we'll never hear because this country deliberately denied the opportunity to brilliant, budding young Black composers and musicians. How tragic that we never will have our souls enriched or our spirits uplifted, the brushstrokes of the masterpieces that could have been created by young Black artists from 1830, 1820, because they were denied the opportunity to develop their skills and talents because of the color of their skin. How unfortunate that there won't be medicines and new technologies that might have emerged from hungry young Black minds, had those young Black minds been given the opportunity to grow and be developed. So we all have a sort of lose by this intentional denial of opportunity simply because of the color of one's skin. It's illogical. The opportunity costs are enormous for all of society. It's such a waste of our most valuable asset, our human capital. And so the speech that I'm giving today, which is of absolute importance, is expanding opportunity. Because if we have more opportunity, if we're more intentional about creating opportunities, we can start to deal with the inequalities, the gaps that exist in education, in income, in education, in housing. So my plea this morning is about expanding opportunities. That's my speech.
Thank you, Carlton. Carlton, let me start with you as far as questions and kind of building off of what you were just talking about. We've heard it before of many businesses that want to hire more minority candidates, or they want to work with more minority-owned businesses, and they come to a point and they say, well, I just I want to do this, but I can't find enough qualified applicants, or I can't find the qualified businesses. But I think as we relook at that statement, it really misses the point of that you're not getting people to that point, or maybe you're not looking even deeper to find those applicants or those businesses. How would you respond to that? And then I'll open it up to the rest of the panel.
I think there are two pieces to that. One, we need a deeper pipeline. I'll let some of the other panelists deal with that, but I'll deal with the one about you can't find them. Let me give you a real life example. I chair the Nom/Gov committee of a large bank, and we were looking for a new director. And the board wanted more diversity, gender diversity. And so we wrote the attributes for the board seat. Sitting CEO of a Fortune 500 company was number one. We think there's value in having that. We wanted the company they're running to be a complex company, typically having some regulatory parts to it. And we wanted female. So those were the attributes they gave me. It didn't take me long to realize I'm going to be bumping my head up against the wall here, because how many female CEOs are there of Fortune 500 companies? Last time I looked, there were 27 of them. A lot are new. Some have been around for a while and have board commitments already. So by the time I realized I had a universe of 0 that I was going to be looking to recruit from. So I went back to the board and I said, we have a problem here. Let's look at what these attributes say. Do we really need a sitting CEO? C-suite experience is important. Could we not get a chief operating officer, chief human resources officer, someone who was a CFO? Why does it have to be a sitting CEO? Once we did that, expanded the pool, we now have 150 candidates. So I think it's about how do we position the requirements for that particular job that sometimes restricts our pool. I think it's artificial.
Others want to chime in there on that question of looking
Sure.
beyond just these initial requirements that businesses often put out there.
Yeah, I'd be happy to comment on that, but if you will indulge me, I actually want to comment on several things. First, going back to Don's remarks, I think it bears repeating this concept of lack of trust. And as I describe it, and I'm engaged with a lot of CEOs right now around this call to action, and we have those who are cynical, particularly in the African American community, that this will be just another moment that will pass after the protest. And then there are those who are hopeful and optimistic. I happen to be in that latter category, and I see this moment as very different from any moment in my lifetime, and similar to the Emmett Till, what I call the Emmett Till moment, where more Americans could see and get insight and join the effort. The movement was already going on, just like it has been now, but more Americans. And that's why I think we have the best opportunity that we will have for most of our lifetimes to actually make meaningful change. And the other point, Karen, where Karen talked about statistics to numbers. Another part of my conversation is we have to take a mirror approach and a window approach, right? This is with corporate America. It starts by looking in the mirror. And so Karen, and talking about the numbers and what they're doing, right? Me as a treasurer, right? I can give you the numbers and what I'm doing, but we can't have credibility and we can't be real if we're not doing what we do in our own respective organizations to advance these issues. And then Carlton made a critically important point, particularly in the space in which I operate as a fiduciary to a $35 billion pension system, investing in corporations and doing this and you have to think about the best interest in the economic arguments. And that's a critical part of this. When Carlton talked about, these are your customers, these are your, right? So why should corporate America care about these issues? Because it's going to undermine their business interests. It's not only the right thing to do, it undermines. And Goldman Sachs, an economist for Goldman Sachs has gone on record within the past month saying, if we don't address systemic racism, this will be really bad going forward for our economy and for the financial markets, but connecting all of those dots. Now, with respect to this question of, that's been the story of my life, listening to people say they can't find qualified applicants. And the, part one of that is, well, have you asked yourself whether or not you're looking in the right places, right? Have you had an intentionality? Because what you plan for, what you're intentional about. And as a partner in a large law firm for 21 years, I spent a lot of time focusing on this can't be just we're good people. And therefore, naturally, this is going to organically happen. No, we had to create systems and policies and procedures to say, well, the Rooney Rule, right? From the NFL, we said no hiring without a diverse panel, right? And that would not be approved for hiring for a position unless you brought a diverse panel for consideration, right? So policies like that, looking at firms that specialize in outreach to more diverse audiences or professionals. So all of those efforts, you have to be intentional about it, and then you'll make more progress on it. Pipeline programs are critically important in terms of, go ahead and develop the talent, because you have the entry points and then you have the success, the ability to rise within the organization. But if you don't have mentoring, if you don't have the tools and the wraparound and that intentionality about developing diverse talent, and you say, and I'll be, I am in an extreme place of candor, right? And feel like this is a moment to really share stuff that I don't typically get to talk about as state treasurer. But, in the law firm, you have associates. Most of the associates in large law firms have spent the summer before. Everyone's recruited, vetted. They spent a whole summer with the firm, evaluated. And then you see they come in as first years, and why is there more billable hours given to associates who are white as compared to others, right? And as you start delving into this, I said, well, it's kind of human nature, right? You want to invest in people that look like your kids. If they remind you of your son or your daughter, you're going to naturally want to, hey, work on this deal with me. Hey, I connect. But what happens when nobody in leadership, nobody that you work with, you don't remind any of them of your son, of their son or daughter, right? And so these things that happen, we have to be intentional about being focused and addressing them. And so I think lots of, the numbers bear this out, right? There are lots of qualified candidates who've gone to the right schools now, who've gotten the right degrees, who've had experience. There are lots of them, and we just need to be intentional about pursuing them and creating a process to attract, retain, and promote.
I would just add to those points. I agree greatly. I think we pay attention to the things we measure. And so when we make this a metric and we make this something that we are judging and assessing our success around, it generates a different level of attention to it. I also think that we have in this society created a very segregated society in ways, and so our network tends to very often look like, as the Treasurer Wooden was just mentioning, right? We sort of stay in a pool that we know, and so what folks need to do is broaden their pools and broaden their networks, and that's in all sorts of ways. Professional networks are just one way, but we know a lot of things happen in those social, non-professional settings where connections get made, where mentoring relationships get formed, where you hear about a company, you hear about a prospect, and we need to be diversifying those networks as well, because that's where so much of what happens in business actually generates and starts and builds. And so I pay attention to what are those circles, how are we diversifying the circle that you travel in, and the pool that you're then delving into. Around recruitment, I mean, there are no end to the number of universities that are turning out graduates of color, majority and HBCU and other universities that are turning out people of color. There are no end to the professional associations that are affinity group related, that are connected to any industry that you're looking for. And so I think people need to think beyond the limited network that we can all be guilty of swimming within, and broaden that.
Thanks, Karen. Don, anything that you want to add on to that topic, and also just in your role at Quinnipiac? And I know many corporations have diversity and inclusion programs. Are those making a difference? How do you make those more than falling into a corporate structure where it's something we do every year, and make it something meaningful?
So one of the first things I wanted to say is that I think when people talk about the idea of opportunity, I think it's important. One of my mentors always would say, success is when opportunity meets preparation. We have people who are prepared, but we need the opportunity in order for us to be successful. And so one of the things that happens in the higher education sector is, there are calls for, diversifying faculty. And, usually, with people with PhDs. And so in order for a person to get a PhD, they have to have been given the opportunity to go to a school, to graduate and get into a graduate program. And so in addition to having a pool problem, we also have a pipeline problem, which we have to address, specifically talking about the higher education sector. And when it comes to having, corporate diversity officers or chief diversity officers at institutions of higher education, one of the things that becomes problematic is when people assume that it's just the sole responsibility of that position to do all of the work for equity and inclusion, and that's not the case. on my campus, I compare it to having a chief financial officer. We have a chief financial officer, but he's not the person who's responsible for doing everyone's budget on the campus, right? Everyone has to have a working knowledge of how their unit functions, the way that they use their budget, right? And so they have to do their work, and he oversees it. Similarly, as a chief diversity officer, it's not, our goal, or it's not our role to do all of the work for an institution that has, over 10,000, 500 students and 1,000 or so employees. It can't be the work of any one person or any one office. And I think when it gets directed to the person, it takes the responsibility away from others, because they can just point to this position and say, oh, we have it, now we're good. But that's not the case. And so when we talk about equity and inclusion, we need to be talking about it in a way where it's built into the fabric of any institution that we would be talking about who wants to be doing this work. And so it's, again, when we were talking about the corporate, partners who are out there, say posting Black Lives Matter, it sounds good. But if we were to, peel back the layers and look at their boards, do their boards represent a true commitment to the idea that Black Lives Matter? And so, it's more than what people are saying, what people are posting. It's about what we're doing. What are the policies and practices that we have in place to break down these walls and to provide people with the opportunity that they're needed? And the last thing I'll say is, when we're doing this recruitment, active recruitment specifically for people who have been minoritized is not a passive act. It's active, right? When we think about discrimination, when we think about the walls that have been put up to keep people out, there were active policies and practices that were in place to do that. And so as we move forward and try to remedy that, we have to be actively engaged in tearing down that wall, to open up the door, to create the pipelines, and to give people opportunities. And so it's not a passive act to recruit and retain, is an active process. And I think we have to be committed to that if we're really going to be making any difference in the numbers that are represented at our institutions.
Garrett, if I may, just one final point for Sean, as you're interacting with your CEOs. What I've discovered, Sean, just as important as it is to have a mentor for a minority promising executives, is more important to have a sponsor. Someone who's in the room when they're not in the room, advocating for them, dropping their name, making sure people know about them. So if you could sort of add that to your repertoire when you're dealing with your CEOs, to make sure that promising candidates have a sponsor someplace in the organization.
Yes, no, that's an excellent point, Carlton. And there's actually an excellent article, I think it was written in the Harvard Business Journal a number of years ago, around the importance of sponsorship. And, again, going back to my experience in the law firm, we did exactly that. Right, and this touches upon kind of a couple of concepts here, Don and yours, is that so you have mentors to develop, right, and that's more day-to-day blocking and tackling, but you have kind of folks higher in leadership who are in those rooms that can engage, that can advocate for you in navigating kind of in the big picture sense, and it was important for us to, in fact, the executive committee of the firm all decided at one point, after some discussion, to actually take a leadership role with respect to engaging associates of color and mentoring / sponsoring, right? So that gets at, the ownership for advancing this work was not just left to the HR person or our chief diversity officer, but it became kind of a leadership ownership throughout the organization, quarterbacked by the diversity officer.
Karen, let me turn back to you. You had mentioned, at the chamber we did make a statement, but I really want to focus on all these other issues that really go into economic growth, because it's not just saying we want growth to occur. And I know you've been on the front lines advocating for these for many, many years. But maybe for everyone, you can talk through just how you see these other issues impacting overall growth and the stances that you feel need to be taken.
Sure. when I think about um, inclusive growth, I've been entering it very much from the perspective of looking at the communities and the patterns of development that have happened in our state. And we see today the end product of governmental and banking and business decisions that go back many hundreds of years at this point. Policies that have been on the books and enacted that have created opportunity for some and very exclusively excluded others, as Don was mentioning. This was active work. And so as we think about equity and inclusive growth, we need to be as intentional about creating things that are dismantling and disrupting those patterns that have been in place for so long. And so, you know, as we are very awakened right in this moment to racism and making statements about anti-racism, we have to also look at things like housing and zoning policy that are created to keep certain people in communities and other people out of communities. We have to think about, as we're thinking about focusing on racism and anti-racism, we have to think about our educational system and how it is structured and funded along those ways as well. And so our growth as a region is connected to how we're able to address equity issues within our cities and our surrounding towns, such that we can create a sense of not taking from someone else, but a sense that we all grow together when we can address growth in an equitable way. So very real things I think we need to think about. Our job growth and our housing growth are connected. To attract people to this region, people have to be able to afford to live here and want to live here. That's connected to our transportation policy around how we move people around this region. It's connected to what kind of businesses are attracted here and supported being here and in this region, how we think about ourselves, not just as individual cities and towns, but as a region that will grow together in ways. I think in this moment, that is also a moment of a health pandemic, a moment that has focused us on essential workers. It's a moment to think in inclusive growth about how our growth is tied to whether we are able to create jobs that really value people and pay them at an essential level that allow them to live in our communities. And so the issues of wage and reimbursement are a part of the inclusive growth conversation. And this notion that it's not that we can't approach it pitting one's interests against another's interests, but we have to approach it from a way that business growth is going to be connected to the fact that we can have an educated and skilled workforce that can live in proximity to the jobs, can get to the jobs, will want to be in the community and raise their family in that community. The growth of this region will mean that as people age and retire, that we have structured the community in a way that people can afford to remain in this community and take advantage of the businesses and amenities in this community. So growth is going to need to touch on all these other sectors that your statement so ably called out.
And I'll open this up to everyone else. I mean, inclusive growth has been this buzz phrase for the last couple of years, but it really needs more action behind it. And so other thoughts from the panel on how we move on.
I think we, you know, the buzz phrase is not necessarily a reality just yet. And this was really underscored with the phase 1 of the PPP small business loans. And Congressman Jim Himes and I co-authored a piece highlighting how small businesses in communities of color were really bypassed in that. And that's directly related to the fact that, you know, the growth we've seen in our economy in recent years has not changed at all the lack of infrastructure and the banking deserts in communities of color. As a former city council president in Hartford, I remember when, in terms of the Black community, when the last bank pulled out, literally no major banking institution in that community. And so the small businesses that typically would have a relationship with those local institutions don't. So you're left to credit unions, to community development institutions and other things. And so I think it's still a buzz phrase, and we need a lot of work, and we need to build better local access to capital initiatives to truly kind of have an inclusive growth in our economy.
Anyone
And
else want to?
we've been able to accept as normal the fact that in a society there are entire groups that will be left behind, and inclusive growth forces us to wrestle with the fact that our destinies are intertwined, and that we cannot any longer tolerate and accept the fact that there will just be these race-based economic gaps that exist in our communities. And so that's what's being centered in this moment. And Sean is very, very ably calling out, the gap between what we're acknowledging in this moment and the actions that need to happen for us to realize the endpoint of inclusive growth. Which, right at the end, if we were to truly have a society where we could say we had moved beyond race, where we had implemented anti-racist strategies that had been effective, we will no longer see race-based disparities in any of our outcome measures. We will no longer see race-based disparities in wealth creation, in accumulation, in home ownership rates, in education attainment, right? That is what we will see if we get there. And we know at this point that we still have a lot of ways to go in order to create a space where we have really enabled that opportunity for all to result in outcomes that have enabled everybody to succeed.
Garrett, I am hopeful that this time is different, because if one were to go back 52 years ago, after the summer riots of 66 and 67, Johnson commissioned Otto Kerner. Otto was a former governor of Illinois, moderate, to study why the riots happened. And Johnson expected the answer to be outside agitators, maybe some foreign intervention. But the Kerner Commission came back with probably one of the most powerful government-sponsored documents which chronicles racism in this country and what needed to be done, how the exclusionary practices were creating two Americas. Unfortunately, that document was published in March of '68. The next month, Martin Luther King was killed, and the document was rejected by Johnson. He didn't like the answers he got. And most people never got a chance to absorb what the Kerner Commission talked about. But these are not new issues, any of them. They date back 400 years. But anyway, we dealt with it 52 years ago, but it's not been really dealt with. I'm hoping this time is different.
We're getting close to the top of the hour, and so I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. And obviously, we can talk about these issues, and we should continue to talk about these issues a lot. But maybe a closing statement from each of you, and just a couple of things. We did say this is lip service to action, so some action steps that you think businesses should take, and maybe around some of those actions, inactions, they may not be aware of the impacts of them, that you see that are keeping us down. Sean, I'll start with you.
Great, and I love the title for the program today, and I think it's very appropriate. I think today, immediately I would encourage everyone to look in the mirror and to say, how am I doing? How is my organization doing? And what can I do today to make a difference? Whether it's, for corporations, and someone raised it, and I'm leading an initiative around board diversity. And launched it last fall, and just promoting board diversity. But it's that conversation of saying, look in the mirror, pipeline programs, critically important in terms of jobs, development. You know, Carlton shared his story. I've heard countless stories of some of the most successful African Americans in business who have come through programs or have been connected where someone's reaching out and making an investment. That's something we can do today. Supplier diversity programs. These are all things, just being intentional about those efforts within the things that you control is the first thing.
Karen?
I would say that each one of us need to take an opportunity to notice who's included and who's been centered in our work, notice who's been excluded and marginalized in our work. From that noticing, which will be a continual process of continuing to do that, make a plan, figure out some steps that you can take in your business, in your steps, in your realm that can help you take a step toward including and based on that noticing, including and centering some that haven't, and then continue to assess how you're doing. That this is a process of growth. It is not a there that we will get to overnight. It is a there that we'll get to by continual noticing, planning, taking action, and reassessing, and being willing to accept when we've taken a step forward and be willing to accept when the work that we still need to do. So to stay in it with eyes wide open, hearts open to learning and making some plans with real actions.
Thank you. Dom?
I think they really summed up what we all need to do as far as taking action. So I think it is important that we talk about, this title, moving from lip service to action, and understand that there are things that we have to do in order for us to grow through this moment. And so I'm hoping that we can move on from solely symbolic gestures to a place of real commitment to create anti-racist policies and actions that will bring us to the place that we are aspiring to be. It's going to really take commitment. And I really like what Mr. Wooden talked about and really taking a mirror approach and looking to see what we have. And Karen, when you talked about this idea of looking at who's at the table and who's not at the table, and holding ourselves accountable as we create these strategic plans and we create these metrics so we can know if we're meeting the measures that we state are important when we talk about inclusive growth or inclusive excellence in our institutions.
And Carlton?
I absolutely agree with all that's been said. But the reason I love business people is that we have a tendency to get to what the issues are, the challenges are, and create a clear pathway, clear vision as to how we need to solve them. So I think the business community has a tremendous role to play in helping to right this ship and helping to get rid of some of the inequities that exist in this society. It's just a matter of will we. I contend to you that you don't have a choice because we're all in the same boat. So unless we can all row in the same direction, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to be successful as a business owner over the long haul. So you really don't have a choice.
I want to thank all of our panelists, especially on this Juneteenth. And I also want to recognize, and Howard and I have had this conversation, that there's a tremendous burden on African-American business leaders to talk about these issues. And really where we need to start moving to is white business leaders talking about what they're doing. And so this is our first step, but our next turn is to turn to the white business leaders to say, okay, what progress have you taken? How have you looked at your business? And how can we make changes? So this is just the first step in our process. And I want to turn now to Howard, our vice chair of the chamber, who's going to give us a closing statement. But again, thank you to all of our panelists for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it. Howard?
Thank you, Garrett. Certainly is an honor to be on this call with the esteemed Brother Carlton Highsmith and Karen DeBose Walton, Sean Wooden, also Sean. It's a true honor. certainly agree with everything that was said here today. I want to just take just a few minutes to also thank Jeff Klaus, who was the strong advocate for me to be a part of the chamber, which I was very reluctant for some time to be a part of, based upon the history of the chamber and their lack of inclusiveness when it came to dealing with minority-owned businesses, particularly Black businesses. You know, I have frank conversations with Garrett, and my conversations were that the diversity and inclusion, the whole concept of it, is, you know, is sort of checking the box, so to speak. Basically everything that was said today. And to Mr. Carlton Highsmith's point, you know, my mission while I'm on the board at the chamber is to ensure that Black business owners and minority-owned businesses have an opportunity to do business with larger corporations. And through a partnership with the Black Business Alliance, we intend to ensure that these opportunities are given to the minority businesses. You know, as Mr. Highsmith said, you know, business is going to play a huge role in right-sizing what the wrongs that have been done to Black and minority-owned communities. So it's extremely important for our leaders, you know, such as the ones that are here today, to be very focused on, you know, building capacity within Black businesses, building capacity within Black communities. And I think that through the project that is going on now, that I'm learning about all of the work that Karen is doing at the Housing Authority and the other corporation, and the work that Mr. Highsmith is doing on Dixwell Avenue in New Haven, it's the perfect time for us to be able to begin to collaborate. Within the Black community, there's a lot of healing that needs to take place. There's a lot of relationship building, a lot of repairing of relationships that need to take place before we're going to be able to move forward and really make a true impact. I would also suggest that there's a generational divide. The younger generation that are out there protesting, they're putting their lives on the line, and they really need some of the wisdom and understanding of what racism is in order to be really truly impactful. And as Garrett said, you know, I did make this comment that, you know, inclusive growth is not necessarily a Black person's problem. I would call it a, you know, more of a white issue, in the sense that there's exclusion on their part. So I think there's internal work, meaning within communities, that needs to happen, but then there's also external work that needs to happen as well. In minority and Black-owned communities specifically, we need to begin to heal from the trauma we call slavery and also racism, because it's deeply ingrained in our DNA. With that, the last thing I'll say is that we need to really focus on closing the wealth gap that has been created as a result of all of these systemic oppressions and so forth. Last I went to a Yale philanthropy conference. It was said that the wealth gap between all ethnicities, and the baseline was the white community, the wealth gap between Blacks and whites was the deepest, and it stood at 227 years. So we have a long ways to go. I think that's a great goal to achieve, is to close that wealth gap. I would say also focus on building our Black and minority-owned communities, and then focusing on supporting Black-owned businesses will be with a lens of equity. With that, I'll stop there. I want to take this opportunity again to thank you all for being on this panel. Certainly look forward to continued conversations and working along with you as we look to right-size these inequities.
Thank you, Howard, and thank you for your leadership on this, and we will be relying on it a lot as we move forward. As I said, this is just the start, just the beginning, and we have a lot more work to do, and we really need to get into the hard part of the work. Again, thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you for everyone who joined us. It is Juneteenth. Please take this opportunity to think about our own actions and how we can continue to move forward. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.